They stopped him and humiliated him for fun. Handcuffs, mockery, and taunts. Just a game for the police who had no idea they were dealing with a surgeon rushing to save a life. Everything changed when one of them realized that this life was his own daughter. The contempt in his eyes turned to horror. His voice faltered, and his confidence vanished. But what happened next will shock you. Daniel Carter wasn't just any surgeon. At 36, he was one of the top surgeons at a prestigious hospital in Manhattan. Every day, he fought against the clock, risking his sanity, his body, and his own life to save others. Known for his calm under pressure, his precise hands, and a mind that never stopped strategizing, Daniel thrived in high-stakes situations. But tonight, his world was about to unravel. He barely had enough time to get to the hospital. A young girl needed surgery, a life-or-death operation. The twist? Her father was one of the local cops. The pressure was immense, and Daniel knew he was the only one who could save her. Grabbing his jacket, throwing his tools into a bag, and slamming the door behind him, he raced against time, ignoring the chill creeping into the evening air. Time was slipping away. He jumped into his car and turned the ignition, praying for clear streets. The last thing he needed was a delay, but fate had other plans. As he sped down the block near his apartment, two squad cars peeled out of a side street and blocked his path as if they had all the time in the world. Daniel didn't think much of it at first. Then the flashing lights filled his rearview mirror, and a wave of panic hit him. He instinctively pulled over, his heart racing. Being stopped wasn't new to him. Driving a nice car through a predominantly white neighborhood in Manhattan made this a frequent occurrence. But tonight felt different. The first officer, a young man with a scruffy face and a slight bald spot, strutted up to the car as if he owned the road. "What do you need?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp with irritation. He could hear his heart thudding, the pressure building. "License and registration," the officer said flatly. There was something smug in his tone. The second officer, shorter and stockier, leaned against his cruiser with a grin, pulling out his phone. Daniel didn't miss the way the man's fingers twitched, ready to hit record. "Here," Daniel said, reaching into the glove compartment with shaky hands. His mind raced, calculating how much time he had left to save the girl. Before he could hand over the documents, the second officer chimed in. "Hey, man, we saw you hit the gas back there. What's the rush? Running from something?" He held up his phone, aiming it at Daniel, a smirk spreading across his face. A chill crept up Daniel's spine. His palms were sweating. The world around him seemed to shrink. "Look, I'm in a rush," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm headed to the hospital. I have a surgery to perform. A little girl's life is on the line." "Surgery? Really?" the young officer mocked, his voice rising in pitch. "What? You going to operate on the kid or run off with something?" Daniel's stomach flipped. Every second spent here felt like a lifetime stolen from that little girl. He tried again, his voice taut. "I'm a surgeon. I'm trying to save her life." The cop smirked, leaning in closer. "You're more nervous than a doctor ought to be. You sure you're not just another guy trying to outrun the law?" He motioned to his partner, who chuckled and kept filming. "This isn't a hospital, pal. This is the real world." Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel. His pulse pounded in his ears. "I'm late," he repeated, his voice cracking under the pressure. "I need to go." Without warning, the second officer yanked open the car door and grabbed Daniel by the shoulder. "Out of the car," he ordered. "What are you doing?" Daniel protested, jerking back in shock. "Hands behind your back. You're under arrest." The cop sneered, twisting Daniel's arms behind him. The cold bite of handcuffs dug into his wrists as the phone camera zoomed in on his face. "You think you're special? You're just another black guy in a fancy car," the officer hissed. "We got you now." Daniel's world spiraled. The humiliation, the rage, the desperation, it all overwhelmed him. He tried to explain, but his words felt hollow. They dragged him to the station and shoved him into a holding cell. The cold, gray walls closed in around him, amplifying the absurdity of the situation. He sat on the bench, staring at his cuffed hands, frustration burning in his chest. He was supposed to be in the operating room, saving a life. Instead, he was locked up, powerless to do anything. Every minute that ticked by was a punch to the gut. Suddenly, a guard appeared, slipping a note through the bars. Daniel grabbed it, his heart pounding. The scrawled words read, "You're needed at the hospital. Get there." His mind raced. Who had sent it? Did it matter? All he could think about was getting to the little girl. But as he stood, another figure stepped into view. It was Lieutenant Ross, the officer in charge. He sauntered in with a smug grin. Well, 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 he drawled. You thought you were above the law. Huh. Turns out you're just another guy who got caught. Daniel's jaw clenched. I'm a surgeon. That girl needs me, he said quietly, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. Ross leaned in, his grin widening. You think that makes you special? You're not. You're just another black man trying to outrun reality. The words hit like a slap. But before Daniel could respond, another officer burst in, pale-faced and frantic. Lieutenant, he stammered, we made a mistake. That girl, she's your daughter. And this man, he's her surgeon. The room fell silent. Ross's face drained of color. His bravado crumbled. What? He whispered, horror dawning in his eyes. Her surgery, it's life or death, the officer added. And he's the only one who can do it. Ross turned to Daniel, his voice shaking. Please, he said, desperation replacing his arrogance. I didn't know. Please save her. Daniel met his gaze, his own emotions roiling. After a tense pause, he said, laws are for everyone, not just those who matter to you. Without another word, he walked out, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. As Daniel walked out of the precinct, a cacophony of emotions swirled within him. Each step brought him closer to the hospital. But the memory of the encounter lingered like a shadow. The humiliation, the rage, and the helplessness gnawed at his mind. He knew he needed to set it aside, to focus on the girl who needed him. Yet, the systemic flaws he'd just experienced felt too heavy to ignore. The drive to the hospital was a blur. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the dark interior of the car. The streets, though eerily quiet, felt hostile, a reminder of how quickly things could turn. By the time he pulled into the hospital parking lot, his heart was pounding, not from exertion, but from the weight of the responsibility awaiting him. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. Nurses and doctors bustled about, their faces taut with worry. The girl's parents, Ross and his wife, stood by the operating room door. Ross looked utterly broken, a stark contrast to the arrogant figure Daniel had encountered earlier. His wife clung to his arm, her eyes red and swollen. Daniel approached, his presence commanding attention. Ross tried to speak, but Daniel held up a hand. There's no time for apologies, he said, his tone firm. Right now, I have a job to do. Ross nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. His wife whispered, please, save her. Daniel entered the operating room, his focus sharpening. The girl lay on the table, her tiny body hooked up to a myriad of machines. The medical team looked to him for direction. With a deep breath, he began, every movement precise, every decision calculated. Hours passed as he worked, his hands steady despite the emotional turmoil. Finally, the surgery was over. Daniel stepped out of the operating room, pulling off his gloves. He approached the anxious parents, his expression softening. She's stable, he said. It'll take time, but she's going to be okay. Ross broke down, tears streaming down his face. His wife sobbed, clutching Daniel's hand. Thank you, she whispered. Daniel nodded, exhaustion etched into his features. Take care of her, he said simply before turning to leave. But the story didn't end there. Word of the incident spread quickly, sparking outrage and debate. Social media exploded with discussions about racial profiling, police accountability, and the biases that pervade society. The video of Daniel's arrest, captured by the officers, became a rallying cry for change. Daniel, initially reluctant, found himself at the forefront of a movement. He spoke out about his experience, using it to highlight the systemic issues that affected so many. His calm, measured voice resonated with people across the nation. inspiring protests, petitions, and policy discussions. Meanwhile, Ross faced his own reckoning. The precinct launched an internal investigation, and he was placed on leave. The incident forced him to confront his own biases and the culture within his department. He publicly apologized to Daniel, not just for his actions that night, but for the broader injustices he had perpetuated. Months later, Daniel and Ross met again, this time under different circumstances. Ross had sought Daniel out, determined to make amends. They sat across from each other in a small coffee shop, the tension palpable. "I can't undo what I did," Ross began, his voice heavy with regret. "But I want to do better. I want to help make things right." Daniel studied him for a long moment before nodding. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about changing the system. If you're serious, there's work to be done." Together, they began collaborating on community outreach programs, police reform initiatives, and educational campaigns. Their unlikely partnership became a symbol of hope, proof that change was possible, even in the face of deep-seated prejudice. The girl, now fully recovered, often visited Daniel at the hospital, her bright smile a reminder of why he fought so hard. And as Daniel continued his work, both in the operating room and in the public sphere, he carried the lessons of that night with him, determined to create a world where no one would have to endure what he had. If you were in Daniel's shoes, how would you have handled the situation? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters. And together, we can work toward a better future.